Okay, now let's talk about a different aspect of configuration. Let's talk about service discovery, specifically using Spring Cloud Eureka. Now this is about a concept called passive service discovery. So what I'm going to do is explain a little bit about what passive service discovery is, and then I'm going to give you the specifics about how to build and run your own Spring Cloud Eureka server and how to build and run a client that uses the server. So first, what is service discovery? To explain service discovery, think about a chat client. If you've ever signed into a chat client, think about exactly what happens. When you come into the chat client, you're instantly greeted with a listing of all of your friends who happen to be online. And if you think about their perspective, they could suddenly see you pop into the list along with everyone else. So what's actually happening is a two-way transaction of information. The client comes in and registers itself with the server, so the server knows who you are online. But then the server gives you something as well. The server provides you with a list of all of the other known clients. So this is basically what service discovery is all about. In essence, your client has discovered the other clients in exchange for the act of registering. And the other side of that is your client has itself been discovered by anyone else who cares to use that information. Well, when we use microservices, we typically have a large number of services that need to be interrelated. They need to call each other. And this is very challenging to configure, as I mentioned in the last unit. So the idea is, how can one application easily find all of the other runtime dependencies? Well, you could configure this manually, even using something like Spring Cloud Config Server. This is impractical because it's brittle. There's just too much to do. So what service discovery does is provide a single lookup service that is in essence self-maintaining, because the clients register themselves and in the process they discover the other registrants. Now this is something that has several solutions right now. There is Eureka from Netflix, there's Console, there's etcd, there's Zookeeper, there's SmartStack, there's a number of things out there. I've probably worked the most with Zookeeper before coming to Eureka. And of course, this session is going to focus on Eureka for service discovery. Now, what is Eureka? Eureka actually comes from Netflix. Netflix is, of course, a widely respected organization that has transformed itself through its IT infrastructure. And along the way, they have taken the time to open source a lot of their infrastructure because it happens to be general purpose. And one of those is Eureka, Eureka for service discovery. So it has been battle tested by Netflix. It's being used right now as we speak by Netflix in production. So what Eureka does is it provides a lookup server. And a lookup server is generally going to be a registration of all of the clients that check in. And generally, there will be multiple Eureka servers running, and it will be, this is how we make it highly available. Not the same way as the configuration, the Spring Cloud configuration server. We made that highly available simply by running multiple copies behind a load balancer. This is actually running multiple instances that intercommunicate with each other. And what they do is they copy the replicated state of the registered services between them. The client side of this is that through a client library, the client will register with the Eureka server. And when it does, it will provide some basic information, most notably the host, the port, and some other things that come in handy later, like a URL that the server or another party can call to do a health check to make sure that that service is actually up. And then the client services also periodically send heartbeats to Eureka. And Eureka, the server, will remove services that it hasn't received heartbeats from in a specified interval of time. So let's talk a little bit about Eureka Server specifically. First of all, Spring Cloud makes it really easy to make your own Eureka server. Now you can download the open source bits, but what Spring Cloud has done is made it so has made an easy wrapper for these Netflix libraries. What you can do is basically just make a regular Spring Boot web application and have the enable Eureka server annotation in it. So in your dependencies, one of the dependencies that you would include in your Spring Boot application is a Spring Cloud Starter Eureka server. And this brings in all of the necessary Netflix libraries plus the Spring Cloud libraries that kind of wrap the Eureka libraries. Then all you need to do is in your application configuration class, one of them, is just put enable Eureka server. And that's all you need to do to turn the Eureka functionality on. Now, usually you want to run, in a production environment anyway, you want to run multiple Eureka servers simultaneously. For one thing, if you look at this illustration, you probably want to run in different zones, different racks, or potentially even different regions as we have illustrated here. Eureka is made to run multiple copies that intercommunicate. In fact, you'll get some errors or warnings in the log if you only have a single instance running. It will basically be warning you that all of its information is subject to loss if it goes down. The Eureka servers are intended to communicate with each other to share the state, and this is how they provide high availability. You can have as many Eureka servers as you want. 3 is kind of a good typical minimum for this type of thing. Each server is usually configured with the URL to the others. That can be provided by the Spring Cloud config server if you want. So basically what you could have is one server, one jar that's deployed multiple places, and potentially have multiple profiles to activate different copies of the Eureka server. Now there are some common configuration options for the Eureka server. To see the full list, go ahead and go out to github.com and look at the Netflix site for Eureka. And in their wiki, they have their documentation there. I found it a little bit tough to absorb the documentation, if I'm honest. But let's talk about some of the common settings here. First of all, the first one I want to show you is one that has nothing specifically to do with Eureka at all. It's really just about Spring Boot, and that's the server port here. You can see I'm setting the server port to 8011. This is a YAML file, obviously. And so this will control the HTTP port that this application will be exposing to the outside world. Now everything under the Eureka level is specific to client and instance. And the Eureka server is actually a client because it talks to other Eureka servers. So there are a couple of different things here. You have a couple things that you can set, a status page URL path, a health check URL path. These are things that you can set to indicate where you want, what you want to advertise to the outside world as far as your health and information page, and also the host name, where you are actually running from. Now, the client section is a little bit more interesting to me. And take a look at service URL. The default zone there indicates the server that you want this client to connect to. And this can actually be a comma-separated list of servers. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, I'm a little confused. The top of this slide is talking about servers, and we're talking about servers here, but this section is about client. Well, again, the server is a client because it talks to other servers. So this is essentially saying, for this server, when it starts up, what other Eureka servers should it talk to, should it register with? There are also the register with Eureka flag and fetch registry flag. The false settings that you see here are not the default. This is something that you can use when you are running a single copy of a Eureka server. It basically says, this is basically your way of saying, look, I know that I have only one instance because I'm just doing some local testing. So please don't bother registering with the server, and please don't bother fetching the registry. What this will do is it will cut down on the warnings that come up in the log when you run a single copy of Eureka. Definitely not for production use. In production, you want to have multiple copies, and you want to register each server with another server. So a server is very easy to set up. Let's talk about a client. Now, from a Spring Boot application, it's very easy to work with Eureka. You just add a dependency. From org Spring Framework Cloud, add Spring Cloud Starter Eureka Server. Then the only thing that you really need to do is add an annotation to enable discovery client. Now, I find the name of this annotation very interesting because it doesn't say enable Eureka client, it says enable discovery client, which is kind of interesting because it keeps the point open about what technology the server would be using. From a client's perspective, it's just it is a discovery client, and it is expecting to talk to a discovery server. You will find in the API an Enable Eureka client, but the preferred one to use would be the Enable Discovery client. Now, the only setting that you need to set in your application properties or your application YAML is the location of your Eureka service URL. And that's under this default zone setting. So this is saying go out to this server, this port, and go to /Eureka. Now, you could have any Eureka instance here. Any instance will do. And usually what we want is several comma-separated URLs here. And this is something, by the way, that you can set up with Spring Cloud Config. You can have Spring Cloud Config describe where the Eureka servers are in one spot, and then have the clients start up and bring that information down when they start up. Now, that Enable Discovery client, what does it actually do? Well, that's really the only code that we have to have on our client. What it does is it signals Spring Boot that it is time to automatically register itself as a client with the Eureka server. And when it makes that call, it will register the application name and its host and its port. And it will use the values from the Spring environment, which you can easily override. So for example, you can give your application a spring.application.name, and it will use that. Now, when we do this registration, the application becomes an instance and a client. It becomes a client and it becomes a consumer of information. And because it's a consumer of information, we can use something called a discovery client to locate other services. Take a look at this snippet of code here. This code is in some Spring Bean, and you can see that we have auto-wired a field called Discovery Client. Discovery Client is actually part of the Spring Cloud Netflix libraries. It is used with the Eureka server to discover other clients. When you look at the code here, you can see that what it's doing is we're using it to go out and get instances of something called stores. Now, stores, in this example, is what Eureka calls a VIP. We would refer to it as really just the application name of the Spring.application name of another service somewhere. And then you can see what we're doing here is doing a null check and then getting the URI and then using that for something, maybe making a REST call or something like that. Now later on in the course, we'll see that there are easier ways to do this when we get into Feign. But for right now, this is how we would actually obtain information on other clients using the Discovery client. The main thing to notice here is we don't have any configuration files. We don't even use Spring Cloud Config Server to obtain the URI to the other services. We're looking it up dynamically from Discovery Client. Okay, so now let's think about some considerations here. One thing you're going to hear a lot about, especially when you read the reference documentation, is a reference to things we call zones. Now, the Eureka server is intended for multi-instance use. And as I've mentioned, when you run in standalone mode, it will warn you if it can't find any peers. And that's exactly what those two properties were about to disable the registration. The Eureka server, if you think about it, the Eureka server keeps all of its information in memory. It does not persist anything to a database or a file or anything like that. So if you shut off a Eureka server, all of that information of who's who goes away until a server comes back up. So it relies on client registrations and the periodic pinging that's going on to keep itself up to date. So it's always up to date, or relatively up to date, and it's always in memory. So this is what we call a stateful application. This is intentional. If Eureka did try to persist some persistent storage, well, the first thing it would have to do when it would come up is it would have to double check all of that information, because it would probably be inaccurate anyway. So in a typical production usage, we have many Eureka service instances running, and we run them in different availability zones. A zone in classic Amazon usage is basically a separate data center. Another thing you can do is run them in different regions. And the reason for this is if you were to have an outage of an entire region, say some natural disaster or something, then your application would actually be resilient enough to use services found in the other regions. Now, Which should come first? In the last module, I told you about the config server, and in this module, I've told you about the Eureka server, and they have similar overlapping responsibilities. The config server can be used to configure anything, but we wouldn't want to configure service-to-service information. We would want to use Eureka for that so that services register themselves. And there is a certain amount of configuration, like the location of the Eureka servers, and should we put that in the config server? Which one should go first? Well, the default is what we call a config first bootstrap. So this means that if a client uses Spring Cloud config and uses Spring Cloud Eureka, it will first bootstrap itself with the information from Spring Cloud config. And that means we could use the config server to configure the location of the Eureka server. Now that, of course, implies that the Spring Cloud config URI is configured in each application, this is the same URI that we learned about in the last module. The other one, a little bit less common, is the Eureka first bootstrap. And this is interesting because this means that you don't have to configure the URI of the config server. You would use Eureka to expose the location of the config server because the config server is just another client. Now, this is going to imply a couple things. This means that you have to set your Spring Cloud config discovery enable to true, and that you have a Eureka client service URL default zone configured in each app. The other thing it implies is that the client is going to make 2 network trips before it's able to obtain the basic configuration. So if you have the bulk of your configuration served up by the config server, you might not want to do this second option here. You'll find the first option, the default, to be better. Go ahead and configure each application with the Spring Cloud config URI. Use Spring Cloud config to handle the bulk of your configuration, and when it comes to service-to-service registrations, use Eureka to do that. If you'd like to learn more about this, there are some blogs that I'd like to refer you to. Pause the video here and jot down these links, and you can read about Eureka itself and a little bit about microservice registration and discovery with Spring Cloud using Netflix Eureka. So to summarize here, passive service discovery is self-service configuration. It's having services register themselves with some central repository, and doing so, it helps them find each other's automatically. The Spring Cloud Eureka server is used to hold registrations, and it's also used to share the information on the other registrants that are out there. It also synchronizes itself with the other servers. And the Eureka client is used to connect to the server to register, but also to obtain information on the other clients that are out there. So now it's time to try this out with an exercise. In this exercise, you'll create and run several applications that are coordinated by Spring Cloud Eureka. Specifically in this exercise, you'll have one service that calls many client services to assemble a sentence. Just a simple sentence where each of the individual words is provided by another service. It would be a lot of work to configure this manually, so what you'll do is you'll use Spring Cloud Eureka. You'll set up a server that is going to coordinate this for you. So take a look at the instructions. The instructions, again, are in the microservices with Spring student files, the same GitHub location where you download the student files from. And this is Lab 4.